As I lived my life, as I walked through my busy day, as I entered and exited conversations that made inherent assumptions about how the world works, I found myself with greater and greater frequency beginning to stop and take a moment to consider. How do I know what is real? Why do I believe what I believe? What am I justified to believe? About any situation, about any topic, about the very nature of reality itself, what am I justified to believe? This question is the core concern of a branch of philosophy called epistemology. In 1641, René Descartes attempted to answer this question in a philosophical treatise called Meditations on First Philosophy. He was probably not the first to attempt this, but he is one of the most famous. Descartes begins by presuming that he is not justified to believe anything. He purges himself of all his beliefs. He has multiple reasonable justifications for this first step. One is his observation that there are many opinions he once had when he was younger that he later modified or discarded with age and experience. Another is his observation that, while in a dream, the experience is often indistinguishable from reality. So how is it that he can know that he isn't just in a dream? From here, Descartes tries to justify something, anything, any of his former beliefs. His starting point is the existence of himself. By even questioning if he exists, he justifies belief in his existence. He remarks that I am, I exist, is necessarily a true statement every time it is expressed. In later works, he would sum up this argument with the phrase, I think, therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum. Up to this point, my own conclusions matched precisely with Descartes. While I couldn't justify the existence of my body, or even the existence of the minds of other people, I could at least justify the existence of my own mind by merely contemplating the question of my own existence. But after these first steps, my reasoning parts ways with Descartes in such profound and radical ways that, in order to make my own epistemological reasoning clear, it's probably better that I just express my own judgments and reference Descartes as a possible point of contrast when explaining my own perspective. So, like Descartes, I can reasonably infer that I exist. Now, how do I know that anything outside of myself exists? How do I know that I'm not just experiencing a dream? How do I know that I'm not just a brain in a vat experiencing a computer simulation? How do I know that I myself am not just a program in a computer simulation? The answer is, I don't. I don't know that anything I see or experience is actually real. I have to make a presupposition, an assumption. And that presupposition is, at least some of my perceptions, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, are accurate, meaning they reflect reality. Not all of them are. I can recall based on experience that all of my senses have been mistaken sometimes. I've thought I saw things I didn't see, like a strange and creepy man who turned out to be a cardboard cutout. I've thought I heard things I didn't hear, like the blood-curdling scream of a woman being murdered that turned out to be the screeches of a bizarre species of owl. I've thought I touched things I didn't touch, like an insect crawling on my face that turned out to be one of my own hairs. But without the presupposition that at least some of my perceptions are accurate, I have nowhere to go epistemologically. Without this presupposition, it is game over. I may be wrong. I may actually be a brain in a vat experiencing simulated illusions, but I have no choice to, at least initially, assume that I am not just a brain in a vat if I want to go anywhere meaningful epistemologically. Presupposing that at least some of my perceptions are accurate, how do I make conclusions about reality? This brings me to my next set of presuppositions. I form beliefs about reality based on physical evidence. The more physical evidence I have for a belief, the more justified I am to believe it. The strength of my beliefs should be directly proportional to the amount of evidence I have for them. If I ever doubt the validity of a conclusion I make based on evidence, I can return to that evidence, re-examine it, and see if I come to the same conclusion. Unlike my previous presupposition, which was weak but necessary, This set of presuppositions has self-reinforcing properties that cause it to have some serious power epistemologically. In fact, unlike Descartes, I will argue that every justified belief that we have about reality is ultimately grounded in evidence. And conversely, that beliefs that are not grounded in evidence, and beliefs that are grounded in less evidence, are unjustified and more weakly justified, respectively. In fact, throughout my explanations, and throughout all of the explanations I have presented in my series so far, I have deferred to evidence-based reasoning to justify my claims. For example, in this video, I'll use visual images and evidential experiences that I presumably share with my viewers to demonstrate my points. In other words, even for the purpose of defending the use of evidence, I have to use evidence. The primacy of evidence to my belief justification process is that inextricable. Descartes makes the argument that some high-level rational beliefs are self-evident. For example, the proposition that 2 plus 3 equals 5 is, Descartes argues, self-evident. But I disagree. Rather, when pressed to do so, we can justify the belief that 2 plus 3 equals 5 using evidence. There are a few ways to do this, and here is one. Count out 5 items. Now place 2 items next to those. Then place 3 items next to those, and see if the 2 piles match. This justifies using visual evidence that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Now I suspect one reason why Descartes was so inclined to declare that 2 plus 3 equals 5 is self-evident was, unconsciously, due to social pressure. There are certain beliefs that are so commonly held by individuals in our society that even questioning them evokes ridicule. In fact, my own awareness of these social pressures made me uncomfortable with the idea of breaking down 2 plus 3 equals 5 into an evidentially based argument. These are beliefs that we are socially pressured to have, through both positive and negative social reinforcement. But the reality is, they are not self-evident, and people who say they are may be unconsciously succumbing to social pressure. It is important to remember that, while the emotional reactions of other human beings are relevant to navigating and nurturing our social climate, they have no bearing on the ultimate truth value or justification of a belief. But there's likely yet another reason that Descartes was inclined to declare 2 plus 3 equals 5 as self-evident, and that is because of presupposition 3b. The more evidence we have for a belief, the more justified we are in believing it. Most of us have been trained in basic arithmetic starting at a young age, and our beliefs about basic arithmetic are reinforced by confirmatory evidence throughout our entire lives as we build and verify arithmetic beliefs. Due to the colossal mountain of evidence that we unconsciously use to support it, the evidential argument for 2 plus 3 equals 5 is so strong that it seems self-evident. But in reality, when we think that, we may be unconsciously making an evidential evaluation of that proposition. The place of evidence in justifying abstract mathematical propositions becomes even more clear as the mathematics becomes more complicated. How do you verify your understanding of a basic principle of algebra? How do you verify that you understand integration by parts? How do you verify that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees? By working out the problem on paper and possibly verifying your answers through a computer, calculator, or textbook, all of which constitute a form of visual evidence. Evidence is essential to the verification process of even the most abstract and seemingly purely rational principles. And when we separate those rational activities too far from evidential verification, we are prone to make mistaken conclusions that are inconsistent with reality, such as when we try to do too much of a math problem in our head, using the limited cognition available to render visual images in our mind. The primacy of evidence in justifying my beliefs only becomes more concrete as I begin to reason about the physical world. How do I know what grass looks like? How do I know what concrete sounds like when it breaks? How do I know what a pillow feels like? Because of the sensory memories I use as evidence for these properties. And if I ever doubt the conclusions I've made based on these memories, I can always go back and re-experience the evidence for each of them, which is the evidential verification process. This even applies to more complex physical properties. Descartes uses the example of wax as an example of something whose properties we could only know about through our mind and not through our senses. He references a piece of wax he is holding that was freshly taken from a beehive. He points out that it smells like flowers, has a solid form, and it makes noise when struck. Yet when he throws it in the fireplace, it melts. It no longer smells like flowers, it is no longer solid, and it would only burn his fingers, not make noise if struck. Descartes argues that wax has none of the same properties it had before, and yet he still knows it is wax. And so, Descartes argues, it is only through his mind and not through his physical senses that he perceives wax. Yet again, I believe Descartes is unconsciously ignoring the physical evidence he used to come to those conclusions. If Descartes, as a child who had never before seen wax, happened upon both a honeycomb and a melting blob of wax in a fireplace, I very much doubt he would conclude that they were made of the same substance. It is only through the accumulation of physical sensory evidence that Descartes had gathered through the very experience of throwing honeycombs into fires that Descartes could justify his belief that honeycombs turn into melting blobs of wax. Everything we believe about wax and the different forms it can take is justified by the accumulation of physical evidence through physical experience. What about more complicated and difficult to perceive physical phenomena, like wind or radiation? For wind, even though we can't see it, we can feel it, and we can even see the things that it affects. Also, we can measure it through physical devices like anemometers. Physical devices like Geiger counters are particularly relevant to our measurement of radiation, since we can't necessarily feel it. The topic of radiation itself presents an important change in the gradation of the strength of my beliefs. While I have colossal mountains of personal experience to use as evidence for the principles of basic arithmetic and the existence of grass, pillows, and wind, I have not personally, consciously experienced radiation. In fact, how is it that I am aware of the possible existence of radiation at all? This introduces another important set of presuppositions, which can themselves be justified by evidence. It would be infeasible for me to try to personally collect all the evidence I use for my beliefs. I can gather new types of evidence in the form of multimedia, writings, and testimonies given by other people. Because I am not personally experiencing the direct physical evidence that these multimedia, writings, and testimonies represent, I cannot place as much confidence in them as I can in direct physical evidence. With the introduction of these new types of evidence, the world of my evidential reasoning both explodes with new possibilities and becomes more complicated and epistemologically dangerous. If I want to maximize my confidence in a belief, I should only use indirect evidence given to me by other people as a starting point, and then directly verify the physical evidence myself. If I refuse to do this for any belief, I must accept that my confidence in it should be lower than my confidence in a belief based on physical evidence that I have directly verified. Why is it that I'm so skeptical of the conclusions of other people? Why do I place such greater confidence in evidence that I can verify directly? The reason is because of limitations that I recognize in myself. I have frequently and consistently misperceived the details of the physical world. For example, I have frequently misread emails, articles, or comments, only to return to them later and realize my mistaken perception. I have frequently and consistently misremembered what were possibly originally correct perceptions. For example, I've frequently misremembered quotes or physical details of scenes from movies I watched as a child, only to return to them later and realize they weren't as I remembered them. And finally, I have frequently and consistently miscommunicated what were possibly originally correct memories. For example, when explaining algorithms to students in the lab I teach, I sometimes accidentally leave out important details due to the mental resources consumed by the process of explaining. Even in the process of writing the transcript for this video, I've noticed that my ability to explain has improved after allowing myself a night of sleep to free up cognitive resources. As a result, Whenever I receive testimonial evidence from other human beings, I am at risk at all times of receiving a miscommunication, of a misremembered misperception. During the process of telling a story or giving a detailed multi-phase explanation, another human being may make multiple errors on all of these different levels. The complication becomes even worse if that human being is depending on a story or multi-phase explanation provided by another human being, and so on. I later discovered cognitive psychology research demonstrating just how common these errors are among human beings, and just how unaware we are that we are routinely making these mistakes every day. The fact that we are unaware of these cognitive mistakes is pivotal to how they are propagated. It means that even when we feel we are being completely honest, and feel that we are being completely coherent, we can still miscommunicate, misremember, and misperceive, and possibly never realize we made the mistake. For example, as you are watching this video, it is very likely that you have missed some details about it. For example, because at least some of its content is probably thought-provoking to you, it's likely that sometimes your brain has launched involuntarily into your own personal thoughts, whether you wanted it to or not. When your brain does that, it consumes cognitive resources that you were previously using for attention and perception. And due to the detailed nature of this discussion, it's likely that you either did not perceive or misperceive some details. If you ever go back and watch this video again, it's likely that you will discover that you missed at least some details in the video that you had no memory of after the first viewing. If this is your first time watching the video, you'll likely have this experience even if you feel very confident that you've been following me precisely. I've caught myself experiencing these holes in perception when watching nature documentaries, listening to audiobooks, and even when reading Descartes. It's only because I can rewind these media forms that I can become aware of the details I've missed. Imagine the missing details we could discover if we could rewind our experience of reality. Most of the time, we conduct our lives almost completely oblivious of these misperceptions. Our brains are very adept at filling in holes in our misperceptions to build a story that is so coherent that we rarely recognize the holes are even there. Which, for the sake of smooth cognitive functioning, is probably a good thing. But it is important for us to be aware of these cognitive weaknesses. And recognizing their existence demonstrates the inherent superiority of experiencing direct evidence in comparison to relying on our own memories and the memories of other people. After years of learning and developing my skills at applying these basic principles of evidence-based reasoning, I was in a better position to evaluate the use of more advanced evidential principles such as Occam's razor, as well as examine the relevance of these principles to some of the more contentious claims made in human society throughout human history, especially concerning the existence of God. When I created my first video on evidence, I was operating under the inference that almost all of my viewers had both experienced evidence and had been aware of experiencing evidence from their daily and academic lives that already supported the arguments I was making. And so I inferred that most of the arguments I was making would be pretty uncontroversial. As I discovered from some of the critiques I received in the comment section and video responses, however, I was quite mistaken in that inference. So before moving on to the next part, I'll respond to some of these criticisms and shore up the arguments I made in the first video. Not that this is a bad thing. Responding to these criticisms strengthens the comprehensiveness of the foundations of evidentialism. To begin my epistemological journey, I made two provisional assumptions. I exist, and my senses are sometimes accurate. These provisional assumptions might be wrong. They're just hypotheses. But if I don't assume them, I have nowhere to go epistemologically. I would have no power to infer anything about the world around me. Now, despite this, some people immediately jump ship at this point, saying, "You can't just assume that," which was a response that, at first, I found a bit perplexing. What exactly are these people trying to say? Are they arguing that they don't assume their own existence? Are they arguing that they don't assume their senses are ever accurate? Anyone taking such a stance would be espousing radical skepticism, which is the philosophical position that knowledge is impossible. And this position takes us nowhere. If this is our stance, then it's game over, epistemologically. There's nothing to think and nothing to do because we can believe nothing. Either you make these provisional assumptions with me, or you choose to believe nothing. I don't really see any alternatives. This appears to be a true dichotomy. But there's another, more reasonable concern about these basic assumptions. Some people have argued that if I make these basic assumptions, I can just assume whatever I want. But that isn't true. If I were assuming whatever I want, I would assume I exist, assume my senses are sometimes accurate, assume the natural world is all there is, assume there is no God, assume that abiogenesis did not originate from an intelligence, assume there was no intelligent design in genetic diversity, assume all religious experiences are delusions, and so on. Alternatively, I could assume I exist, assume my senses are sometimes accurate, assume there is a supernatural, assume there is a God, assume this God created all life, assume I'm going to an afterlife when I die, assume that God is guiding my life, and so on. But I'm not taking either of those highly presumptive stances. On the contrary, I am assuming as little as possible, just to function in the world, and then letting the evidence tell me the rest. Another criticism was that while I make assumptions, rationalists like Descartes don't make assumptions. Rationalists are just observing a priori truths. To which my response is, how can you know a priori whether something is a truth? To which a common answer is, you can know a set of statements are true if they are internally consistent. Well, first, that is an assumption. But let's entertain this principle and see how well it holds up. This type of epistemology is called coherentism. Namely, beliefs are true if they are members of a coherent set of beliefs which both support and don't contradict each other. The beliefs are internally consistent. But coherentism has problems that can be illuminated right out of the gate. Take 3 different religions: Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism. All 3 of these religions can be formulated in a way that they are internally consistent. But clearly, they all contradict each other. Therefore, they can't all be true. Therefore, internal consistency among a set of beliefs is not sufficient for truth. This is called the isolation objection to coherentism. Namely, a set of beliefs can be internally consistent in isolation without actually being true. And at least 2, if not all of these religions must be false, since they can't all be true. Now, while internal consistency is not a sufficient condition for an epistemology, it does appear to be a necessary condition. And the argument of evidentialism is that it is coherent because the physical universe itself is coherent. This is not just an assumption. This is an evidence-based argument. It can be built off of evidence-based sub-arguments, such as the fact that multiple independently manufactured temperature gauges will all report the same temperature in the same geographical location at the same time within a given error range. So the claim of internal consistency doesn't rescue rationalists from the fact that they are making at least some assumptions, just like me. No matter how much you may try to squirm out of it by euphemistically labeling your assumption as self-evident or as an a priori truth, the reality is you are making an assumption. And it is more dangerous to unconsciously make an assumption but confidently label it as a truth than it is to consciously make an assumption and humbly be prepared to discover that it isn't true. Another very common objection to evidentialism is that it is self-refuting. Namely, if I say, only beliefs that are justified by evidence are valid, that claim itself is not supported by evidence. In my previous video, my implicit answer to this supposed refutation was that every belief except these 5 provisional assumptions or hypotheses needs to be justified by evidence, which is a pretty good answer, because it's not like the first 2 hypotheses are shielded from themselves either. For example, if you say, "I think, therefore I am," your statement itself assumes the existence of an I who can think. And if you say, "My senses are sometimes correct," how are you going to prove that? With your senses? Therefore, again, these first 5 can just be taken as provisional hypotheses that are open to future refutation or revision. But I can do better than that. Let's take another approach so I can quell any possible objections that evidentialism is self-refuting. Most rationalists, even Descartes, do believe that physical evidence is a valid way of justifying beliefs. So let's scrap that third set of hypotheses and add this as a provisional assumption that we all share. Using this shared assumption, the thesis of evidentialism is that all beliefs are justified by physical evidence. This is no longer a simple assumption. We are upgrading this to a full-fledged, large-scale, evidence-based argument. And as I just said, that's okay, because even rationalists agree that physical evidence is a valid form of justification. So what is the evidence for this argument? Well, it contains many sub-arguments, and my series serves as one of the many platforms that presents sub-arguments to support it. And I will present further evidence for this thesis now. One of the criticisms leveled at the thesis of evidentialism by many atheists was that some beliefs are true, but not based on physical evidence. One of the most common examples was mathematics. Math, they claim, is a purely rational activity. It has no basis in evidence. Mathematics is based on proofs, and proofs are purely rational. Let's examine this claim. The generally accepted basis for all of mathematics is set theory. For example, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Set theory discusses sets, which are well-defined collections of objects. But where does the idea of sets itself come from? I think the evidence indicates that the origin of the idea of sets is pretty clearly the physical universe. Without a physical universe containing collections of discrete objects, how would we abstract the idea of sets? Imagine we lived in a universe where there were no discrete objects, where all things oozed and melded into each other. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets in such a universe? Or imagine that our brains were initialized into a blank empty space. How would we ever abstract the idea of sets if there was nothing to collect? From sets, we can abstract the idea of numbers, which are labelings of specific set sizes. From numbers, we can abstract the idea of addition, which is the combination of subsets. Subtraction, which is the removal of subsets. Multiplication, which is the duplication of a single set a specific number of times to form a superset. Division, which is the uniform distribution of a single set into a specific number of subsets. Squares, which are the multiplication of a number times itself. Square roots, which are the inverse of this operation. Infinity, which is the abstraction of imagining what would happen if we started adding and never stopped. Negative numbers, which are an abstraction from positive numbers by imagining they stretched into infinity in the opposite direction. And because when 2 square roots of the same number are multiplied, they reproduce that number, we can then abstract to the idea of an imaginary number, the square root of -1. Abstractions of abstractions of abstractions. This is what mathematics is. And the abstractions of mathematics are only possible because we live in a universe of discrete physical objects which can be grouped into sets. Without those objects, we never would have had anything to abstract from. Over time, we've had to formalize our abstractions based on other abstractions because of paradoxes we discovered in still other abstractions. This has caused us to periodically return to our mathematical foundations and modify them. but I think that the basic ideas of mathematics pretty clearly derive ultimately by abstracting from physical evidence. And this has proven very fruitful for us as a species when isomorphisms between our abstractions and the physical universe allow us to return to the physical universe and apply our abstractions to engineering applications. But what about logic? Logic isn't based on evidence, is it? And mathematics is based on logic. On the contrary, I think it is pretty clear that logic also is ultimately just an abstraction of physical experience based on physical evidence. Let's take modus ponens, for example. If A, then B. A, therefore B. This is so abstract. How could this possibly be based on physical experience? The answer? The evidence of physical causation. If it rains, I get wet. If I touch fire, I get burned. If I drop this glass, I will break it. A little reflection reveals just how ubiquitous this concept is in physical experience, and just how easily we could abstract it from physical evidence. This is strong evidence that the concept of modus ponens is just an abstraction of physical experience. I think the extreme irony of this situation is that we have experienced so much evidence for these abstractions that we no longer need evidence to remember and apply them. And so we find ourselves under the illusion that they are self-evident. But if you ever need a reminder that these statements are not self-evident, just walk into a kindergarten classroom and start spouting them as self-evident truths and expect the children to remember and understand them. You will likely be reminded very quickly that these are not self-evident truths. They are abstractions based on physical evidence. And if you want people who have not yet experienced the evidence for these abstractions to comprehend, remember, and believe them, you must present the evidence for them. This understanding of abstraction centers around the fact that we have an embodied mind, a mind that exists within a body. One of the most visible proponents of the embodied mind argument is George Lakoff, a cognitive linguist. He and Rafael Nunez present arguments similar to mine in the book Where Mathematics Comes From, How the Embodied Mind Brings Mathematics into Being. It is held by embodied mind proponents that mathematics and logic do not actually exist in any real sense other than in human brains. Rather, we construct mathematics and logic by abstracting from the embodied experiences that we have. In other words, from the physical evidence we experience. I think this argument has profound implications for the teaching of abstract disciplines like mathematics, because teachers with a rationalist approach will likely focus on memorizing abstract mathematical truths as if they are self-evident. But teachers with an evidentialist approach will focus on presenting examples that justify the abstractions. The evidentialist will present both the abstraction and the evidence it is based on. The rationalist will only present the abstraction, missing half of the argument, and in my experience, confusing students and obfuscating the learning process. Another failed approach is presenting the examples without the abstraction. A lot of my ire towards rationalism stems precisely from being subjected to rationalist teaching approaches as a student in a highly mathematical discipline. It also stems from being a teacher in that discipline, and witnessing other teaching assistants confuse the hell out of their students with rationalist approaches and then complain because their students just weren't getting it. Based on what I've seen from cognitive psychology, the learning process is extremely evidence-based, where good teachers present abstractions and explain the evidence needed to support them, or present the evidence and explain the abstractions that can be drawn from it. This is related to the formation of semantic and episodic memories, which I'll explain later in the series. In fact, I suspect that evidentialism will win this argument precisely because it's the actual basis of human learning and rationalism isn't, and therefore, rationalism, in trying to defend itself as an epistemology, will likely always come across as more muddled and confused to an audience than evidentialism will. I think rationalism stems from a kind of laziness about abstractions, leaving the job of justification half done, and simply labeling some of the abstractions as a priori truths or self-evident. whereas an evidentialist will take the time to try to investigate and explain where all of our abstractions come from, or at least have the intellectual honesty to admit when the job of justification isn't yet finished. But that's enough criticism of rationalism for now. Let's move on to my final note on what evidentialism is not. A final complaint from many people was that this is just logical positivism. First, no, it isn't. Evidentialism is its own position with its own publications, its own principles, and its own arguments. Second, that's not an argument. If you believe that there is something wrong with either evidentialism or logical positivism, it is your responsibility to make at least a brief argument for what that problem is. A mere appeal to convention is not sufficient. With these critiques addressed, I think this is a sufficient amount of defense for evidentialism to justify moving on. If you would like to present an alternative epistemology that you think better explains justification, you're free to do so. Feel free to attach it as a video response. But I think I've sufficiently justified evidentialism to the point that we can talk about what happens when we apply evidentialism to the hypothesis of God.